Hello, everyone. So it was just a couple of days ago that the 100th birthday of Andrei Sakharov passed. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So, in case you don't know who he was a Russian nuclear physicist and later a courageous dissident against communist oppression, a fearless advocate of human rights in the Soviet Union and around the world. So he was born in Moscow in 1921, the son of a teacher, and the Russian Civil War was just dying down. He was born even before the official foundation of the Soviet Union, because of course the Soviet Union wasn't officially proclaimed until December 1922, although yes, the Bolshevik Revolution had been in 1917. So he had a stellar scholarly career, and he went to university in the 1930s, which of course very, very few people did. He grew up at the height of Stalinism. Of course, he's born before really Stalin becomes the paramount leader, but he will have faced this full spectrum indoctrination into communist ideology and simply been bombarded with a message that Stalin could do no wrong, was the most magnificent man of all time, was a moral titan, and so forth. Anyway, so Sakharov didn't have to serve in the Red Army because of his higher education. Remember, very few people went on to tertiary education those days. At the time that Sakharov was born, only 20% of people in Russia were literate, and a tiny percentage would have gone on to university. So anyway, fast forward till after the Second World War, and he worked under Kurchatov, who's seen as the father of the Soviet nuclear bomb. And in 1949, the Soviets, they detonated their first nuclear device. So it stunned the world and shocked the Americans. So Washington, D.C. was panic-stricken because the Soviets had perfected a nuclear weapon years before anyone had forecast. Of course, the Americans done a lot of the spade work for the Soviets, unwittingly, because the Soviets had stolen America's homework. All right, Australian, Canadian, and British physicists have been working on this in the 1930s, handed their baby on to the United States because only the US had the manpower and the resources to complete the project by 1945. But some American communists had been passing all these secrets to their Soviet handlers for ideological reasons, because their ideological allegiance trumped their national loyalty. So Sakharov, he helped develop Tsar Bomba, as in the bomb czar, the czar bomb, as in like emperor. It was so big, it was so enormously destructive, that's what they had to call it. And Lavrenti Beria personally supervised the project. It would have been hair-raising to have him breathing down your neck. Is that a terrible mixed metaphor? Because Beria was head of the Народное комиссариат внутренних дел, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. That's a secret police in plain English. So it was a prolific torture and murder organization, which must have tortured hundreds of thousands of people. In his time, executed certainly at least hundreds of thousands, sent millions more to slave labor on the slenderest pretext, with scarcely a farcical trial. You'd be toiling in the most horrendous conditions, be brutalized by guards, fed starvation wages, serving the most inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union under the broiling sun or in the bone-chilling cold. And if you messed up, you were straight to a labour camp like that, and if you emerged at all, your health would be broken. But anyway, he managed to stand up to that pressure, Sakharov, and he performed his duties admirably. So by the 1960s, things had changed. Stalin had died. Nikita Khrushchev, or Khrushchev, I think you pronounce it, had been the general secretary for a while. He'd had a thaw, allowing some very limited free expression. Of course, the Soviet Union had been completely airless until that time. Now, Brezhnev had pushed Khrushchev into retirement. Brezhnev went for re-Stalinization. He never went back to the industrial scale killing of his own citizens that Stalin had practiced. But nevertheless, Sakharov gallantly began to speak up for liberty, something that the Russian people had only once, just for a few months in 1917 under the provisional government, saying, but all this is here in the Soviet constitution. It says freedom of expression, but if we tell the plain truth, if we criticize the government, you're branded an anti-Soviet agitator, you're going to a labor camp. We said we're allowed multiple political parties. We've only got one. If you set up a different political party, they call you a fascist. Even that's totally untrue. You're going to a labour camp. We're not allowed to leave the country. We get special permission. Only trusted communists are allowed out, diplomats or Olympic athletes or something. We can't even travel freely around the country. You have to get special permission, even within your own region, even if you're within Belarus or within Kyrgyzstan. You can't just go where you want. So it was a control freak state. And the death penalty was used promiscuously, as was torture. You weren't allowed to send or receive information. You weren't allowed to opine, things like that. Problems could never be faced up to about corruption, about incompetence, about failed policies. And they weren't allowed to receive access from other countries, not allowed, no freedom of association to set up your own, whatever it was, chess club, football club, or astronomy society or something like that. It was a control freak, absolutely paranoid, heavily oppressive government. So anyway, for speaking up like this, for going to the trials of dissenters, he himself, he was locked up. Then he was sent to Nizhny Novgorod, a small city, sort of in internal exile away from Moscow. You really wanted to be in Moscow. That was the best city. With things were happening there, the best goods were there, maybe even meeting foreigners, particularly Western foreigners, though you draw suspicion on yourself for doing that. Second best was go to Leningrad, as it then was, now St. Petersburg, or the capital of one of the Union republics like Kiev, or Baku in particular. But anyway, so he was sent to sort of a third tier city. So he was banished, and of course, yes, you could send letters, but almost nobody had a phone back then, so couldn't keep in touch with family and friends. His scientific career was over, and it was surprising he was dealt with so leniently by the standards of the country, because people had been sent to decades in a labour camp for less than he had done, but perhaps out of deference to his sterling service in the cause of developing nuclear armaments, that he was treated relatively mildly. Of course, under Stalin, you'd be shot in the blinking of an eye for the merest penumbra of suspicion falling on you. But he wasn't actually jailed after a while. He was just under house arrest, then just internal exile, but kept in Nizhny Novgorod for years. And later, Yuri Andropov, later on head of the KGB, as in Komitet na Государственной безопасности, the Committee on State Security. Again, that's the secret police. It had a number of iterations. There'd be one organization be set up, then there'd be a unit within that which would then subsume the parent organization, and it kept changing its name. But Andropov, he was obviously was very against him, said he was public enemy number one. But again, surprisingly, Sakharov was not treated more harshly. Because Andropov, he really wanted to smash peaceful dissents, religious practitioners, or human rights activists, ecologists, anyone who questioned the communist system. So it was a brutal and viciously intolerant system. And there were good things about it too. And certainly by the 70s, everybody had just enough to eat. Everybody had a roof over his head and the minimum of clothes and a few things like that. And you couldn't get rich, not unless you're a very high party corrupt official. But ordinary people, you had other things in your life. The necessities of life were guaranteed. And yes, it wasn't the worst place in the world. There were poorer places. And okay, they had some kind of gender equality, and at least official racial equality. But all sorts of terrible things about it. I mean, as Kennedy said, John F. Kennedy said, we've never had to build a wall to keep our people in. You can vote with your feet. If you don't like it here, you can leave. If you don't like it in a Western country, you could move to a communist country. A handful of people did. But the communist government didn't trust their people to allow them the choice. So there'd been Solzhenitsyn, who was just a few years older than Sakharov, who'd run afoul of the system just after the Second World War, for complaining that he couldn't get a decent pair of shoes, and he got years in a labour camp for to something that's as petty as that. That is how savagely cruel the system was, and how he said how one word of truth is worth it. Anyway, the abuse of psychiatry is going on all at this time, which of course the Soviet medical establishment lied and lied and lied about, but it all came out in the wash in the 1990s. They knowingly misdiagnosed perfectly sane people as insane because they were political dissidents. So they labelled people mentally ill simply because of the political ideas they held, which were often much more rational than the heavily oppressive and utterly dishonest ideology that the governments foisted on people. It wasn't the ideology perhaps so much, but it was claiming that it was egalitarian when it wasn't, or claiming it was free when that was a complete opposite of the truth, sort of the big lie. But anyway, so Sakharov, he started to be known by foreigners, somehow some sort of indirect contact with Western people, human rights activists, the Helsinki Human Rights Group, and his name kept coming up and being published in the Western world, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his fearless advocacy of human rights in the Soviet Union. But he wasn't even allowed to go abroad to receive this. The Soviets did the same to another Nobel laureate of theirs, Boris Pasternak, the author of Dr. Zhivago, that novel of really from the Tsarist era right up to the 1950s. So finally in the 1980s he was released, a phone was installed in his flat so Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary, as a leader of the Soviet Union, could phone him, because it was a real treat if you had a landline. And so in the late 80s he had his freedom back. And in 1989, for the first time ever, someone was allowed to give an anti-war speech in the Soviet Union. But that was only after the Soviet Politburo had already determined they were going to pull their troops out of Afghanistan. So should you fight a foreign war or not? Surely this is the kind of thing which is extremely worth debating. It's a matter of intense public interest. If you believe so, of course you should be permitted to have your say, and those who disagree must be allowed to have their say. Otherwise, there's total unfreedom, and indeed there was complete unfreedom. So, in Western countries there were at least anti-war movements. Did these countries fight unjust wars sometimes? Yeah, they did, but there was freedom, whereas in the Soviet Union there most certainly was not. So dissent was ruthlessly stamped upon. It was a merciless system in which people really had no rights and no right to complain. The state was all-powerful and really didn't care, which wasn't answerable to people. So people were dubbed extremist for simply asking for their rights under the Soviet constitution. And sadly, it's come full circle with what you see with Putin today. If you're simply labelled an extremist, then you're going to jail. Those wanting to reopen labour camps, as they've just said. And now Putin's allies are even going so far as to exhort the Gulag, saying they did people a favour by teaching them skills. Just a pity several million of them died in the process. You could easily have taught people skills without working them to death. But the thing is, if Putin's opponents are extremists, it must automatically follow that they're extremely opposite to he's extremely opposite to them. So by his own rationale, he's an extremist too. And extremely what? Extremely honest, extremely brave, extremely humane. Just being extreme isn't necessarily a bad thing. So you can be a pro-Putin candidate, you can vote for a pro-Putin candidate or a pro-Putin candidate. So you're not allowed any choice. So having elections which are complete charade, farcical trials, holding political prisoners, that's come back. It's not political prisoners by the millions as it was in Stalin's day. And obviously the murder of peaceful dissidents at home and abroad. So it's an awful pity. I mean, there are many Russians I really like, and there are admirable aspects of their culture in terms of music or cuisine, architecture, splendid things like that. So it's just a pity that they're lorded over by this monstrous government that they have, calling journalists terrorists just for reporting the news is what's going on now. So Sakharov, then he died in 1989, that December, very shortly after he was released. He'd already seen the unravelling of the Soviet Union, a small-scale, irregular conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So where is he now when we need him? Someone who was so valiant, sorely missed, should be an inspiration to everyone. And he was lauded by the Soviet government in the very twilight of his life. And look how his memory is sadly been dishonoured by the wretched regime in the Kremlin today. Goodbye.